Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? We ride the stories of the West campfire. Truth's trail dust memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. Before the light found the ridge, Jack Hale broke the skin of ice in his water bucket with his palm. The crack was clean. His breath unrolled in the dark room and hung there. The cabin was one room, a table that rocked on a knotted plank, a potbelly stove scabbed with old soot, a rope bed that complained when he moved. He shaved by guess at a thumb-sized shard of mirror nailed near the door. The glass was cloudy. It caught one eye and made it look flat as slate. He looked away. He fed the stove with splits of aspen. The fire took after a minute, slow to believe. Coffee boiled in a blackened pot and smelled like the inside of a barn in winter, bitter and strong. He ate a square of hardtack and felt the grit of flour between his teeth. When he opened the door to the stoop, the air bit the soft inside of his nose and made his eyes water. The San Juan Range ran like a ribcage under pale sky. Somewhere below, a creek spoke under a lid of ice. A hawk crossed above the tree line without a sound. Jack watched it until it was just a smudge and then nothing. Brim snorted in the lean-to, steam puffing from his nostrils. Jack ran a hand along the horse's neck and felt the coarse heat of him. He said nothing. He hardly said anything to anyone. Red Hollow lay a long ride north and east. People there called him Hale because that was enough, and he liked how it sounded like a hard thing you could hold. He went to town when he had to. He kept to this hill when he did not. He poured coffee into a tin cup and stood at the door, the heat of it warming his lip, the cold taking the rest. In a dry attic over a kitchen that never quite warmed, Nora Quinn tied a narrow red ribbon into her hair. Her fingers were cracked white at the knuckles from lye and cold water. She tucked a worn book under the straw tick and smoothed the blanket flat with her palm. She could feel the outline of it through the fabric, the way a person feels a bruise even when it does not hurt. The stairs woke and complained when she walked them, but she knew the boards that stayed quiet and stepped on those. Downstairs, the stove had gone out again. Her Aunt Maud Dalrymple came in holding her shawl closed at her throat. Fire, Maud said, and mind the bacon. Last time you burned it. Yes, ma'am, Nora said. The bacon had not been burned last time. There had not been enough of it to burn. She worked fast. Coal dug from a bucket. Kindling. A match you had to coax. When the stove yawned and took, the room changed, but it was a grudging change. Heat slid along the floor and partway up the wall. Nora set the pan and watched bacon sweat itself into the cast iron. She laid plates, poured water, kept her face empty. Reuben Dalrymple came down with his vest unbuttoned and his boots untied. He always looked a half step behind himself, like a man chasing a hat in wind. Going into town, he said to the air. For work, Maud asked, without looking at him. For business, he said. At the word, something in his mouth went small. He sat and ate fast, his fork scraping the tin plate. He did not thank the food. He left with his hat in his hand, and the door did not fully latch behind him. Nora washed up. The water was so cold it made her wrists ache. She pressed the ribbon into her sleeve seam and felt the small knot under her skin. After she took the broom to the hall, Runner carried a pail to the yard, split it into two, and scattered the worst of the ash under the lilac that would not bloom. It was a morning that felt like holding your breath. When she brought in wood for the afternoon, she heard men's voices in the front room. She stopped just before the parlor, the wood stacked in her arms, and listened. The door was mostly closed. It was the kind of close that still meant, go away. Sound carries through old wood even if you want it not to. Reuben's voice was higher than usual. Debt is debt, Mr. Malloy. I am a man who honors what I owe. Another man answered. He sounded like he had swallowed whiskey with his breakfast. It made his words slick. I like that. I like a man who knows his place on the board. 200 puts you level plus interest. I draw the papers and no one talks about it. It is not just the number. Reuben coughed. She is quick with figures. She can help keep your books. She would be an asset. Nora shifted one foot. The top log slid a fraction. She froze. Victor Malloy laughed. It was soft at first, then wet, then gone. She has a face that will fetch. She can pour and smile. She will not touch my numbers. She is young, Reuben said, and strong. I do not buy strong, Malloy said. I buy compliant. Call it a marriage paper if you want to sleep at night. I will put a ring on her finger where the boys can see it. You know what I mean when I say entertain. The ribbon in Nora's sleeve warmed and cooled under her skin. She stood very still and counted her own breath the way you do when you want to hear something and not hear it at the same time. "Tomorrow noon," Malloy said. "Bring her to the Iron Horse. I do not like men who are late. It makes me think they have gotten ideas." "I will have her there," Reuben said. The sound of a chair on the rug. The room swallowed the voices. The door opened. Nora backed away and walked to the kitchen in a straight line and put the wood on the stack she had made in the corner. Her hands were steady. Her mouth had gone dry. Lunch was a heel of yesterday's bread and coffee that tasted like the pot. Maud ate with the same small bites she used when she knew a thing and did not want to say it. Nora found the seam in her sleeve with her thumb and pressed it until it hurt. "When you finish the washing," Maud said without looking up, "iron Reuben's shirt with the good cuffs." "Yes, ma'am," Nora said. Afternoon turned to a darker shade of gray. The house held its sounds close. Reuben walked through the kitchen once and did not look at anyone. His boots were muddy at the edge where mud always dries. Nora ironed and did not look at the parlor door. When the clock in the hall told 6, she put the iron back on the stove, folded the shirt, and slid the ribbon out of her sleeve. She tied it in her hair with the quick knot she could do without a looking glass. She went upstairs. She pulled the book from under the mattress and wrapped it in a piece of muslin. She took the biscuit she had saved and put it with the book. From the peg, she took her shawl, which was not warm, and put it around her shoulders. She stood very still and counted to 50. The hallway made a sound like the house taking a breath. The latch on the back door liked to stick. She knew the way to push the thumb screw and lift at the same time. She did it, and the door came. The night air slipped a hand under her shawl and laid it on her back. She stepped out onto the stoop. The yard smelled of cold earth and the ghost of lilacs that had not bloomed in years. "Where are you going, girl?" Reuben said from the woodpile. He stepped out of shadow, and he was just Reuben, not a monster. That almost made it worse. Uncle Nora said. The word came small. "Please, do not make me drag you," he said. His voice had no heat in it. "You know how this works." "You are selling me," Nora said. The words had to pass over something in her throat, and it hurt. Reuben's face pulled. He did not look at her. He said, "You ate in my house 12 years. There is a cost." She moved. She was quick and light, but he knew the yard and how to corner a calf. His hand found her upper arm. His fingers were hard from chopping and from counting coins that were not his. The slap surprised them both. It made a sharp sound in the cold, and even the house held it a second. She did not fall. She tasted metal, and it tasted like a penny held too long in a warm palm. Maud stood at the top of the stairs inside with a lamp that smoked. "Put her in the cellar," Maud said. Her face did not change. "We will deal with the rest in the morning." The cellar door was scarred where men had set salt pork and apples down 100 times. Reuben turned a key that was always in his pocket and had never meant anything to Nora until now. The stairs were mean. They dropped her one by one into the damp. The smell of rot had depth to it. Potatoes gone to eyes dirt that holds water all winter, old wood that never dries. The door shut. The bolt slid with a sound that felt like hands on her shoulders. She sat because there was nothing to stand for. Her breath made small clouds that vanished. She wrapped her arms around herself and felt the book through the muslin and felt the ribbon in her hair and knew both were small. Up the hill, Jack Hale set his cup on the sill and watched his breath fog the cold glass of the window pane. The fire clicked behind him. Brim shifted in the lean-to and stamped once. The ridge held its blue like a bruise you do not show anyone. Jack lifted his coat from the chair back, shrugged into it, and reached for the latch. The cellar held steady cold. Nora breathed and counted and breathed again. She put her cheek on her knees and tasted dust. Her tears were hot for a moment, and then they were cold. She did not make a sound. The sky over Red Hollow kept a color that could not decide itself. Jack Hale rode Brim down the frozen wagon ruts that split the street and heard the sticky pull of mud under the thin crust of ice. Wood fronts faced each other like teeth. Signs rattled on weak chains. A few faces sat still behind curtains, the cloth bowed where fingers gripped it. The Iron Horse Saloon sat in the middle of the block, with its porch swept clean and its lamps turned low for daylight. The big mirror behind the bar caught whatever light there was and held it like a cool coin. Victor Malloy stood on that porch with one hand in the pocket of a black coat that fit too well for a place like this. A cigar leaned wet at the corner of his mouth. When he smiled, a gold tooth flashed the way a lure flashes in water. A wagon came around the corner of the livery. Reuben Dalrymple sat hunched on the board, his hat pulled low. Beside him, Nora Quinn slid on the seat as if she had forgotten how to hold her own weight. Her dress had torn at the shoulder. Her hair was caught with a red ribbon that did not look like it belonged to this day. Reuben set the brake, climbed down, and put his hand around her arm like he was lifting a bale. She pulled back without words. He dragged her through mud that reached to the ankles. When she put her weight away from him, he grunted and pulled harder. Jack kept Brim steady in the street. He tasted smoke from the cigar and coal from the blacksmith, both stale. The sheriff watched from the post outside the jail with his thumbs hooked under his belt. Amos Kincaid did not move much. He looked the way a cat looks at a room. A silver watch ticked faint in his vest pocket, the sound quick as a nervous pulse. Nora's eyes searched the street. They touched Jack for a breath and then moved on. She tried to turn her shoulder away from Malloy when he reached to take her from Reuben. Malloy did not grab. He laid his hand on the soft inside of her upper arm and guided her like a man at a dance. His smile was the kind that says, "I have already won." He tipped his cigar at Kincaid at the two card players on the boardwalk who were not playing at anyone who had eyes. The doors of the Iron Horse swung and thumped. Malloy walked her into the dark and the warm. The mirror took them and made them two more shapes in the glass. Jack heard laughter slide out and die against the cold. No one spoke to Jack. A boy with a news sheet slung over his shoulder watched him, as if the paper had told him to. A woman with a shawl tucked her chin and drew her curtain, then peered again through a triangle she had left open. Jack swung down from Brim and tied him at Mr. Whitlow's store. The bell over the door chattered when he went in. The air inside held coffee beans, canvas axle grease, and the sweet sting of turpentine. Shelves ran full of things that make a life work: nails in jars, lamp chimneys, a stack of blue enamel plates. Behind the counter, Ezra Whitlow worked his hands over a crate of screws. He looked up, and his face went as pale as flour. "Holly," he said, and dropped the small box. Metal ticked the floor and scattered around his boots. He bent, but his hands did not know which screw to pick up first. Blasted. Jack looked at the wall behind Whitlow, where a calendar showed a summer field that no one here had ever seen. He did not look at Whitlow's face long. 2-inch hinge, steel, a box of eights. Whitlow tried to smile. It came out as a wince. He set a hinge on the counter, and then the screws, and then his hands found the edge of the wood and stayed there. "You see the weather," Whitlow said. His voice was not built for talk today. "You come to town with that sky all on its own to buy a hinge." Jack put 2 coins down. He put his thumb on one and slid it closer. The metal made a small sound. He could hear the piano at the Iron Horse picking up a tune without heart. Whitlow drew a breath and let it out like a man that has been holding one too long. "That girl," he said, not looking at Jack. "Nora. She is a good girl, reads when she can, helps Maud with the wash." He swallowed. The bone in his throat jumped. "We watched him bring her in. We all watched. I had a stack of plates in my hand and I set them down because I felt like I would drop them, and then I did not move." Jack said nothing. He had taken his hand off the coin. His palm left a round, clean place in the dust on the counter. "It is," Malloy, Whitlow said. "He has a way of making law a thing you can bend." Kincaid sits his nights at a corner table. He likes his whiskey at 9, a man of habits. Whitlow looked toward his storeroom, as if the walls might be listening. "I keep oil and pitch back there now that the freight line runs thin old canvas too. Winter bites deep out here. You keep things you did not know you needed until you need them." A chair scraped at the back of the store. A man coughed. Whitlow flinched and then steadied his hands by wrapping them around the hinge. He pushed it across. "You want a sack for that?" he asked. "Road's slick. Things fall." Jack took the hinge. "No." He turned for the door. The bell chattered again and he stepped out into the brittle air. The street had gone quieter, which was a different kind of loud. The Iron Horse looked the same as it had looked before, which was also different. The porch was empty. The mirror inside caught and held the shape of a man behind the bar, his head turned toward the room. Jack untied Brim and put his palm to the horse's cheek. The hide there was warm. He stood a moment with the rope slack in his fingers and let his eyes find the places the town did not look. The upstairs window over the saloon had one curtain that did not hang straight. A curl of red cloth had snagged on a splinter at the edge of the step, a thread that would not let go. He put his boot on the first board, and the wood creaked like a throat about to speak. He did not bend. He did not take the bit of cloth. He turned Brim into the street. As he passed the jail, Sheriff Kincaid took his watch out and clicked the lid and looked at it as if the time could tell him what kind of man he was. He looked at Jack as if he were a door that might open. Jack did not open. The livery boy with a runny nose came out with a fork and a wisp of hay. He watched Jack the way birds watch snakes. The blacksmith lifted a shoe and set a nail and struck it true. Sparks jumped and died on his apron. A wind came down the street and drew the smoke off the saloon into a long, thin line. Jack swung into the saddle. Brim shifted and then settled. Jack held the hinge in his coat pocket like a small rock. He did not kick the horse. He let the animal find his pace. He did not look back at the iron horse and its bright glass and its doors that moved like a mouth. He rode through the bite of air until the street had turned to track and the track climbed and the town lost its edges behind him. On the hill above, spruce opened and closed as if the ridge were breathing. Jack reached for the collar of his coat and set it tight at his neck. The hinge knocked his knuckles when he did it. He closed his fingers around it and felt the smooth faces of the plates and the cold of the screws in the small paper box. He kept Brim at a working trot. The noise of Red Hollow fell behind like a voice you walk away from. The mirror in the iron horse held what it held. The curtains dropped. A red thread stayed on a splinter on a step that led in, not out. A hawk took the high air where the wind ran clean. Jack watched it a moment and then watched the trail. The cold sharpened as the land climbed. The cabin stood where he had left it, a box against a blue cut of sky. He put Brim in the lean-to and rubbed the horse's shoulder until the breath came easy again. Then he went inside and set the hinge on the table where the light caught it. The room did not feel different. He built the fire up and listened until it took. He sat on the edge of the bed with his hat in his hands. The cold left his ears last. Outside, the pines clicked their small winter song. Inside the cabin, the kettle began to thrum. Jack stood and poured the water over coffee grounds and watched the black rise in the pot. He waited until it was strong and poured into his tin cup. He held the cup in both hands for the heat. The hinge sat on the table and shone like a thing that had something to do with doors that stay shut or open. He drank. The coffee bit his tongue. He swallowed and set the cup down and listened to the small sounds of the house he had built for a man who did not expect visitors. He reached and turned the hinge so the light hit the screw holes. He set it square on the table. He did not move it again. He stood and put on his coat and stepped out into the air that took his breath and made it visible and brief. Snow began as flour in the air, a light dust that found seams and settled. In the Iron Horse Saloon, the lamps burned low and warm, and the room held onto bodies the way a stove holds onto heat. Victor Malloy watched the door shut behind Reuben and then turned back to Nora as if the closing had set a clock. He handed her a parcel that shone too bright. "Put this on," he said. She stood in the narrow upstairs room that smelled of perfume gone sour. The parcel held a dress cut from red satin that threw light back at the lantern. The cloth pooled like spilled wine. Nora kept her hands behind her back, fingers pressed into her wrists until they went numb. "I can wash glasses," she said. "I can scrub floors." Malloy did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He took the collar of her faded dress in his fist and tore it. The sound was a hard rip that surprised even the walls. He let the cloth hang off her shoulder like a flag that had lost its pole. "You dress," he said. "You come down smiling." Nora's throat went tight. She felt the cold find the skin he had bared, and she pulled the scrap together with one hand. He set the red across the cot and left. The key turned on the other side. The hall tipped with sound and came level again. Music fell through the boards. A piano tried a tune and found it. Men laughed. The laughs did not have the shapes of jokes in them. She changed with her jaw clenched. The satin clung where it touched and gaped where it did not. She looked for a mirror and found a piece of it, thumbnail, small nailed near a nail hole. It showed only an eye. The pupil was big from darkness. She could not tell what color it tried to be. The door opened without the key speaking first. A woman filled it, slim and tired. Straw hair eyes, the blue of winter miles. She had her own dress in blue that had lost the fight it had started with the years. "Lila," she said, as if to remind herself who she was. "He sent me to fetch you." Nora looked at the floor. The boards rose where knots pushed them and left cups for dust. "I cannot walk in this." "You can't," Lila said. She stepped in. She did not touch Nora. She set a hand on the wall to steady herself as the building gave a small sigh under their feet. "You can walk, and you can pour, and you can keep your eyes where they do you good." "My uncle sold me," Nora said. The words came flat and small. They surprised her by being true even as she said them. "He called it paper. He said it would be legal." Lila's mouth tightened. For a moment, something old and mean flickered there, then went. She reached into her pocket and brought out a key the size of a finger. The brass had been handled enough to warm to a human shine. "This is for the back door," she said. "After midnight, The kitchen boy sleeps with his head on the table. The bolt sticks on the bottom. If you pull straight, it will move. Nora stared at the key. She did not take it. You are not the first, Lila said. Some leave, some do not. Take it. Nora closed her hand around the key. It lay heavy as if it knew what it was. Lila's eyes softened at the sight of the red at Nora's shoulder. Hold your chin up, Lila said. If you cannot have dignity, have posture. They went down. The heat rose like a living thing and met them on the stairs. Smoke found corners and made them thick. Malloy stood at the end of the bar with men whose hats cost more than their boots. He lifted his empty glass and the bartender filled it without looking. The mirror behind the bar held everything and made it cold. When Lila eased Nora onto the floor, the sound changed. A shiver of quiet moved across the room. Men turned their chins and used their eyes. The piano player saw the new dress and modulated like a man who has learned that trick can work. The bartender set down a glass a little too hard. The ring of it did not break. Walk, Lila said softly. Walk as if your feet were yours. Nora tried. Hands reached. Some cupped air to test distance. Some did not wait for distance to be gone. She learned the shape of pulling away without looking like she pulled. She learned how much whiskey fills a glass without spilling when your hand shakes. The red dress read as permission to men who could not read much else. Malloy crossed once and set 2 fingers at the small of her back, a touch that told everyone watching they were free to touch everywhere else. Nora took the key and tucked it under the ribbon at her shoulder, where red met red. She could feel the cool of it through the satin. She did not drink any of the whiskey. When someone pushed a glass at her, she wet her lip and let it look like she had. Down the hill, snow laced the air, and the cabin held tight against it. Jack Hale set the hinge on the table and did not look at it. He pulled the cork from a bottle with his teeth and poured whiskey into the same cup he had used for coffee. He drank until the aftertaste went sweet. The stove throbbed. Shadows slid and stood still. He pulled a block of pine from the shelf and turned it in his hands. His knife cut curls that fell soft at his feet. He carved a line that wanted to be wing, a line that wanted to be throat, and then his hand stopped. He saw smoke in old memory and heard a cry he had never heard but knew. He put the knife back in the block as if it fit there and would not be taken out again. He tried to lie on the rope bed, and the ropes complained. He sat up. He tried to stand, and he did. He drank until the bottle gave nothing. He held the cup to his lip with his mouth empty. The stove ticked small seconds. A mouse went behind the wall and came back and did not care who lived here. Brim stamped and blew and then settled. The hawk of the morning turned to a black triangle in his mind and then broke into daylight again and then was gone. Jack opened the cabinet above the table and took down a box that had the weight of brass in it. He set cartridges one by one on the wood. He picked up the Winchester and ran his thumb along the action. He did the same with the Colt. He did not hurry and he did not stop. When he put the sling over his shoulder, the rifle found its place against him like a thing that knew its home. In the saloon, the hours grew their legs and ran. The piano stopped and started. Lila's face went slack with tired, and then she smiled again, and it looked new each time. Nora carried glasses until her fingers lost count. When the clock struck midnight, the sharp strikes stepped it down through the floor and counted in her bones. She found the hallway and then the kitchen, without any eyes on her, because the room had turned to a story at the far table, and every man had his head pointed at it. The cook slept with his cheek on a folded apron. His mouth fell open a little, and his breath lifted the cloth and let it settle. Grease on cooling pans had formed skins that moved when the door opened. The back door stood at the end of a short hall that felt colder. It was the kind of cold that his shape. Nora put her hand on the top bolt and drew it back slow. It came with a small cry. The cook shifted and settled. She crouched to the bottom bolt and set both hands to it. Rust had taken some of it and left the rest. She put her shoulder into it and felt it give. The door moved on its hinges, and a knife of air slipped along her knees. She pushed again. The gap widened, and the alley revealed itself. Packed snow-broken glass, a barrel that had rotted a third of the way up and fallen in on itself. A shape on the right threw off sparks as it drew. A match head flared and cut the dark. The match lit a face she knew from the room. Brick Talbot held the small flame under a cigar and pulled. The light made his eyes look simple. His hand came up and closed over her mouth before she found breath for a sound. "Little bride," he said around the cigar. The words rumbled in his throat more than in his mouth. Boss forgot to turn the bottom bolt again. She fought. He let her. It did not trouble the big man. He hooked an arm under her knees and lifted as if she were a sack. He carried her back through the kitchen and let the door punch her shoes as it came closed. The cook snored through all of it. Malloy stood at the bar with his coat off and his vest open. When Brick set Nora on her feet, Malloy did not speak. He looked at Brick, noted the cigar, and then looked at Nora. He took her by the hair at the back of her head and did not yank. He made her stand up straight by the grip. He walked her to a door near the end of the hall that was lower than it should have been. He turned a key that had polished the ring it sat on. He pushed her into a room with no window and a dirt floor that had packed to stone with years of barrels and brooms. He set the bar in place on the outside. "No food," he said. His voice slipped under the wood. "No water. See what you cost me." He walked away. Brick's laughter followed and smudged the air. The room had the smell of spilled beer that had dried and been spilled again. It had the smell of mice. It did not have light. Nora put her hands out and touched wall on one side, and then on the other, and then sat because there was nowhere else to go. The snow thickened outside the cabin. Jack let the door stand open, and the cold climbed the room. He felt it in the skin inside his elbows and along the long bones. The night moved past the doorway like a sheet drawn slow. He stepped into it and worked the saddle on as if quiet could dress a horse. Brim turned his head and put one eye on him, and then the other. Jack took the reins without a word. He walked the gelding into the dark, until the trees closed and opened like breath, and the cold found all the places it could, and the slope showed him where it wanted his boots. In the storeroom, Nora listened to the sound of the saloon through the wall. It came like waves and then ebbed. Lila's voice broke once and then kept going. The key under the ribbon had turned from hope to a weight that pressed her collarbone. She took it off and held it in both hands and then put it in her mouth because there was nowhere else to keep it safe. It tasted like brass and hands. She closed her eyes, although the dark did not care. Jack rode until the land sloped wrong, and then right, and then wrong again. And then the ridge turned him toward the line that ran back to the world. Snow soaked into his coat and stayed. He did not urge Brim to any speed. He watched the line where sky and ground could be told apart and kept to it. He set his teeth and let the cold clean the whiskey from his tongue. He had not spoken out loud since he left the cabin. When he did, his voice scratched his throat on the way up. "Enough," he said. The wind took the word and put it away. Brim broke a crust of ice with his hoof, and water sounded under it. The sky leaned close and then stepped back. The trail took the horse, and the horse took the man, and the night kept the rest. Snow thickened into ropes of white that slanted across the street. The iron horse kept its yellow windows as if the storm were only a story. Jack Hale brought Brim up the alley where the wind hit less slid from the saddle and set his palm on the horse's neck. Brim blew hard and steadied. Jack took the Winchester into his left hand and the Colt into his right, then put the Colt away. One clean thought at a time. He went up the front steps. The board spoke once under his weight. He set his heel to the seam where the twin doors met and drove. Hinges screamed. The doors leaped inward and hit the tables beyond with a sound that cut the room in half. Light smoke men. Victor Malloy at the bar with his sleeves rolled, one hand near the shelf where a pistol slept. The big mirror took it all and made it cold. The piano stumbled into silence. Cards paused in the middle of a deal. Jack did not aim at Malloy. He sent the first shot over the man's shoulder into the mirror. Glass burst into a rain that fell slow, bright as ice on a river. The crack of it filled ears and sent men down behind chairs. Malloy flinched and came up cursing. A shot came from a table on the right. Jack felt it pass his coat with the sound of a hornet. He walked never fast and worked the lever. The Winchester spoke again, and the shooter folded into the sawdust with his hat still on his head. Brick Talbot pushed back from a corner with a bellow and a hand already going for iron. Jack turned and shot for the thick part of the shoulder. Brick spun, hit a post, and went to one knee with his hand open. The pistol skittered under a chair. No one reached for it. "Where is the girl?" Jack said. His voice rode the quiet. The room gave it back. Malloy found his own gun. He came up behind the bar with his mouth set to talk, saw the rifle climb toward him, and ducked. Jack sent a round into the long shelf of bottles. Glass and brown liquor blew across Malloy and the bartender, and the air burned with sour whiskey and smoke. The bartender lifted a shotgun with hands that shook, and that was a mistake you only get to make once. Jack put the last round where the wood met the metal, and the man went down behind the bar and did not get up. Jack stepped on the bar rail and vaulted across. His boots crunched on glass. He moved along the back wall, eyes searching for a door that did not want to be seen. He found it blind by the cold that slid along the floor from the seam. A bar of iron sat across it. He tried it. It held. "Keys," he said, not loud. Malloy crawled along the far end of the bar, slick with liquor eyes white. He did not look like a man with keys on him. The room shifted. Someone coughed. The wind agreed outside pressed its hand to the wall and let go. Brick groaned in his corner and groped for the pistol he had lost, found only splinters in the toe of a boot. Jack holstered the rifle and drew the Colt. He put the barrel to the iron bars and fired where the bracket bit the wood. The shot blew it out with a punch. The door jumped. He kicked it once and again, and then the third time it swung. A dark deeper than the saloon waited inside. Cold air breathed out like an animal freed. "Nora Quinn," he said into the black. Something moved. Cloth on dirt. A small sound that learned to be smaller. He struck a wooden match on his boot heel. Flame grew slow. Light showed a dress the color of blood and hands that had not stopped shaking. Her eyes tried to be large enough to see all of him at once and could not. She flinched from the light. He dropped the match before it licked his fingers and the dark returned. He put the gun away and shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her. The wool smelled of smoke and hoarse and cold. She stiffened, then stayed a hands trapped in the heat and not sure whether to trust it. He lifted her as if she were a child and the cot were a riverbank. She weighed less than the coat. He pivoted in the doorway to keep her head from the jam and stepped into the room they had broken. Men watched from behind tables. None of them rose. Malloy stood at the end of the bar with a pistol in his hand and fear on his face. It had sharpened him. "Put her down, Hale," he said. "Put her down and put your hands where I can see them." Jack walked. He did not look away from Malloy. The Colt rode his hip. His boots found the gaps between the worst of the glass by habit. Nora's breath came into his collar in shallow pulls. Malloy raised the gun. His arm trembled and steadied, and then trembled again. He saw Jack's eyes, and something left him. He fired wild, and the bullet found a lamp chimney and sent fire up into smoke. Jack stepped past him, shouldered the door with his back, and came into the porch. The storm had ripened. Snow came sideways and fast. It took the heat from his face and carried it into night. He set his foot into the street and felt the mud give and then freeze around his boot. He set the other foot and kept going. Brim stood where Jack had left him. The horse turned an ear and then both. Jack swung Nora up and into the saddle, then mounted behind and boxed her in with his body and his arms. She felt the weight and the shape of him and went rigid and then limp in the way you go when there is nothing else to be done. He put the reins in his left hand and heel-tapped Brim's ribs. The gelding jumped forward and found a run where there should not have been one. Bullets chased them into the white. They struck posts and kicked snow from fences and bit air that had nothing in it. A window burst behind them, and the wind took the sound away. Jack did not turn. Brim picked a line down the center of the street, then cut for the alley and the cut bank, where the wind came different. Nora's head bent to the coat's collar, and the hat she did not have. Jack felt the shiver of her through the wool. They left the last of the buildings without looking like they had. The world narrowed to horse and drift, and a slice of sky so near you could touch it. Snow worked into their clothes and stayed. Jack put his chest to Nora's back and took the wind that would have taken her. His arm set a cage around her that had nothing to do with jail and everything to do with not falling. The trail out of Red Hollow rose into the first trees and vanished. Brim found it with his hooves, then lost it, then found it again. Branches brought snow down on their shoulders, then brushed it off. The night had no sound except the wind, the rasp of the horse, the soft grunt Jack made when the saddle tried to throw him on a route he could not see. Nora did not ask where. She counted her breath and the beats of the heart behind her. She tasted iron and pine, and something that was not fear, not fully, something like relief that hit too hard and hurt in a new place. They reached the old trapper's cabin at Fallen Pine, when it showed itself as a dark cut in a darker wall. Jack slid from the saddle, and his legs felt the ground, as if it were not sure, then steadied. He turned and lifted her down. Her feet did not know how to be feet. He held her a second longer than he needed to, and then let go. The door stuck and then came. The inside air held a remembered smoke and a long cold that would not give up easy. Jack found the hearth with the heel of his hand and the edge of the table with his thigh. He set Nora on the rope bed, and the bed answered with a groan. She held the coat closed with both hands. Her teeth touched and touched again. "Stay," he said. He went back out into white and came back with an armful of wood that had been stacked under a lip of Eve years ago and had dried slow, hard as old bone. He set kindling and a twist of bark and brought fire to it with 2 matches pressed into one. The flame took and argued and then agreed. The first heat moved like a small animal along the stones, then reached into the room and lifted the cold a fraction. Jack stripped the wet from the saddle and rakes of ice from Brim's mane in the doorway. He tethered the gelding under the lean, where the wind struck less and shook snow from the horse's blanket, and set it over the withers with hands that remembered. He came back to the fire. The coat steamed where Nora had it clamped at her throat. Her hair stuck to her cheeks in strings. Her eyes followed his hands as if they belonged to someone else. He crouched by the hearth and fed the first real splits to the new heat one by one, careful. He did not speak. He did not look for thanks. The cabin ticked as the logs remembered what warmth was. On the floor, water came off his coat and found the cracks in the seams and slid away. The storm climbed the walls. The door rattled in its frame. Jack set the iron latch and put the back of a chair under it, as if the night itself might try the handle. The fire grew until it made a kind of hush, a sound that men listen to without knowing they do. He sat back on his heels and looked at Nora. Her mouth had color again. The red of the dress made a strange light in the room that was both wrong and right. He reached for the kettle and set it on the stone lip near flame. The metal gave a small thrum as it heated. Nora drew the coat tighter. Her voice when it came sounded like a thing that had been outside too long and found its way in. "You do not know me." Jack watched the fire. The wood cracked, then settled. "I know enough," he said. She held his coat with the same care she would hold something breakable. The flame picked lines in his face that made him look older and younger. The wind tried the door and failed. The heat pushed a little further into the room and held. The first heat off the hearth licked at the cold and found it stubborn. Nora Quinn sat with Jack's coat clamped at her throat and could not stop shaking. Her hands were white as wax where the red satin did not cover them. Jack Hale brought the tin pail close, scooped a double handful of clean snow from the lip of the door, and knelt. "Your feet," he said. She did not move. "Give them here." He took her ankles gentle and pulled the thin stockings away. Her feet had lost their color, skin like candle tallow nails, flat blue. He set snow to them and worked fast. The cold tore up through her shins. Pain came back like a flood. She made a sound that stayed in her mouth. He did not stop. "It hurts," she managed. "It has to," he said. He rubbed until the blood rose and the white went to mottled red. Then he did her hands thumb by thumb, palm by palm, snow melting over his knuckles and running down his wrists. He cursed once under his breath when feeling struck like pins. When it was done, he took a strip from the tail of his shirt, dipped it in a scoop of cleaner snow, and dabbed the cut at her lip. He did not look at her face long. He patted the cloth dry and sat back on his heels. The fire found a true flame and set a shape of light on the wall. He set the kettle on the stones and fed the blaze careful. He unrolled a blanket from his saddlebag and shook it out. He pulled a strip of jerky from a pouch and set it in her hand. It was hard and salt and good. "Drink when it sings," he said, nodding to the kettle. Her teeth knocked the edge of the cup when the water steamed. The heat stung the inside of her mouth and felt like mercy. He sat near the hearth with his back to the logs and cleaned the Winchester with a square of cloth and a small bottle of oil, the parts coming apart and going back again with a patience that had no show in it. Wind pressed its face against the walls and dragged its nails along the seams. By the second hour, the fire had pushed the cold to the corners. The storm pushed back. Snow hissed at the door. The draft pulled light across the room, so it moved like water. Nora's hands shook less. She put the jerky in her cheek and chewed. Salt woke her tongue. She swallowed and watched Jack's hands work the rifle. "Why did you come?" she said. The words were soft. They sat down among the other small sounds and found space. He did not answer. His palm slid along the lever. He set the rifle aside and looked at the fire, as if it might tell him something he had missed. Night deepened. The wind found a higher pitch. The heat bled out of the room faster than the wood could replace it. The stones at the back of the hearth held what they could and then let it go. Jack stood and tested the door latch, then came back and spread his bedroll on the floor where the heat was thickest. He stacked his blanket and his coat together and looked at the rope bed where she sat. "It will not be enough separate," he said. "You will freeze." She held the coat tighter. "I can stay under it." "You can try." He stripped off his wet overshirt and hung it on a peg near the fire. Steam rose slow. "Lie down here." She looked at the floor and at the space he meant and at him. His face gave nothing. She slid off the bed and crawled under the pile he had made. The ground was hard and gave back the shape of her hips and shoulders. He lay behind her on top of the covers, his back to the room, his heat a wall she could feel. The cold kept coming. Her shiver worked itself into his shoulder. He let it. An hour later he spoke. "Turn." Her heart jumped. "What?" "Turn your back to me." She did. He lifted the edge of the blanket and pulled it over them both. His arm settled over her middle, heavy and careful, not pressing. His breath warmed the hair at the back of her head. His fingers found her belly and stopped there, open, not clutching. She felt the scar along his forearm against her ribs. She reached and laid her hand over his because the tremor would not stop. His whole body tightened. "Do not start what you are not ready to finish," he said. His voice had a rough edge she had not heard before. She held still. His hand stayed where it was, and then closed around her fingers and stayed. The wind took another run at the door. The fire answered with a crack and a fall of coals. Between those two sounds, her shaking eased, and a steadier heat slid through her bones. The storm took the day and gave nothing back. Jack worked through it in small ways. He cut tinder from the dry heart of a split log and showed Nora how to lay it so smoke would not choke them. He scraped the white fat from the seams of the old stones and used it to start flame when the kindling lied. He taught her to blow into the fire low and slow, not hard, and to step back when it took. She watched and copied and burned her knuckles once and did not make a sound when she did. When the kettle boiled, he handed her a tin cup and then took it back when her hands shook and set it on the floor where she would not spill it. He patched a tear at the heel of his glove with a needle from his roll. The thread was coarse and dark. Nora went to the saddlebag and found a bit of her own ribbon at the bottom of her coat pocket and cut a narrow strip off it with his knife. She worked it into a small knot to tie off the seam inside the lining where no one would see it. The red sat there like a secret and held. He brought in a snare loop tied from an old bootlace and showed her how it cinched. He whittled stakes from a piece of dry aspen and cut a path through a drift to set the loop under the eave where rabbits ran. He showed her droppings and tracks and what they meant. She watched his hands and the easy way they measured. Her breath smoked in the doorway and turned the light thin. By the second day, meat hung thin. He set the Winchester on the table and spoke. "You will check the wire," he said. "If there is a rabbit, you kill it quick." She pressed her lips together. "How?" "Behind the head. Firm." He looked at her face. "Quick." She nodded. The door gave up its cold easy as if glad to see them go. Outside, the snow lay without edges. She picked her way along the path he had cut, found the loop, and found a small gray body tangled there. The rabbit's eyes were black and bright. It kicked. She flinched at the sight of the life of it. She stood with the thing tremoring in the wire, and could not. Jack stood a few paces back and said nothing. She set her fingers behind the head the way he had shown, drew a breath, and pulled. A soft crack. It went loose all at once. Heat limped out of it into the air. She swallowed against a taste that was not in her mouth and lifted the small weight and took it in. Her hands shook after. She took another breath and it steadied. Inside, he set the rabbit on the board and showed her where to open it and how to peel the skin clean. The smell was sharp and strong. She did it without words. He salted the thin meat with what he had and set it near the fire so it would not scorch. The afternoon went to a lower kind of light. He sat on the floor with his back to the bed and pulled a block of pine into his lap. The knife worked with a whisper, while Nora mended a seam along his coat's shoulder. The coat lay heavy and clean now, the wet long gone. Her needle pulled and bit. The red knot she had tied held the inside seam where her fingers could find it. She ran her thumb across it once and kept going. What were they going to do? Jack asked without looking up. The question had to cross some hard ground to get out. It came quieter than the knife. Nora stitched twice before she trusted her voice. "Saturday," she said. "Malloy said there would be a special auction. A wedding for a night. Highest bidder." He laughed when he said it. The knife stopped. Jack set his thumb to a curl and pushed it loose. A sliver of light pine fell to the floor. He reached up and pinched at his collar. His fingers found a hard edge stuck in the wool, a glitter caught in threads. A shard of glass the size of a tooth sat there from the mirror he had broken. He held it between finger and thumb and then flicked it into the fire. It hissed and went to a darker thing. Nora stared at the place where it had been. She held the coat tighter in her lap and kept sewing. With each draw of the needle, the coat mended a line of small dark marks on worn hide. He set the knife back to the block. A curve showed in the wood where a wing might be. He did not say what it would be. He shaved until the floor at his feet was soft with curls. The sound of the blade on wood made a hush of its own. Night built itself thick again. They ate rabbit stew from a single tin cup and handed it back and forth. The broth made a film on her lips. She licked the salt away and felt hunger leave the hard place under her ribs. She lay on the bed after and watched the fire through the space between her fingers. He lay with his shoulders to the floor and his eyes on the roof beams as if the dark had something written up there, just for him. When the cold came in deeper around midnight, he moved to the bedroll again and set his back to her back through the blanket. He did not speak. His hand found the small of her back and rested there, not moving. She closed her eyes and watched the red behind her lids pulse with the heart under his palm. The storm argued with itself through the third morning. Then the wind shifted or tired. The sound changed. The cabin let out a breath it had been holding. Jack stood and opened the door a hand's width. White lay in a clean rise against the stoop, 5 feet deep, where the drift had found the angle. The air that came in was so bright it felt hot on his face even as it cut. He stepped out and sank to the knee and came back with a rabbit taken from a loop that had not gone under. He shook snow from his hat and set the animal down on the board without comment. His cheeks were raw, his eyes clear now that the whiskey had no more anchors in him. Nora fed the fire and then picked up the knife. Her hands remembered what he had shown them. He watched and did not correct. He drew the blanket off his shoulder and put it over hers. The room took in the quiet and kept it. The kettle began to sing again, a small silver sound in the center of the heat. The wind ran out of words. What it left behind was a hush that felt like clean paper. Snow on the pines softened at the edges. Water began to speak somewhere under ice. Jack Hale stepped out first and stood a long minute with his face in the pale sun. He looked like a man listening for a kind of silence he trusted. He saddled Brim and cinched the strap without sound. Nora Quinn wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and watched steam rise off the roof as the sun touched it. The cold still had its hand in the room, but its grip had loosened. Jack filled the kettle and doused the coals until they lay black and wet. He shouldered the rifle and nodded toward the trees. "Come," he said. They walked. The snow held deep in places and thin in others where the wind had worked it. The path dipped and broke and then opened to a low bend in a river. Clear Fork ran fast with melt bright as glass and loud with its own hurry. Ice rims held onto rock like white lips. Jack set the rifle on a granite shelf and turned his back to the water. He stripped off his coat and laid it on a dry patch, then pulled a clean wool shirt from the saddlebag and set it beside it. He kept his eyes on the timberline and the slope that gave down into it. Brim tore at a tuft of dead grass and chewed with small, patient clicks. Nora looked at the river and then at Jack's back. She felt a small shake in her legs that had nothing to do with cold. She unknotted the red satin at her shoulders and let the dress fall into her hands. The color sat on the snow like a wound. She folded it once and then twice and set it on the coat. She stepped into the river in her chemise and the water closed around her knees like teeth. Cold took her breath and then gave it back sharper. She cupped water and poured it over her head and felt old smells slide off her hair. Soap from the cabin cut grease and smoke. She scrubbed the skin at her throat until it flushed and felt like her own. She washed her hands and watched the water take brown and then clear. She went under once to her shoulders and came up with the sound of the river in her ears. The sun sat behind thin cloud. It lit the edge of every drop. When she waded out, her feet burned as life ran back into them. Her teeth clicked once and then held. Jack did not turn. He did not check his watch that he did not carry. He watched the trees until he knew the rhythm of them again. Nora took the clean shirt, and pulled it over her head. It fell to her knees and smelled of smoke and salt and the old resin of wood. She gathered her hair in both hands and squeezed water from it. It fell down her back in ropes dark and heavy. She picked up the red dress and walked to a flat place where the bank had burned once long ago. Jack knelt and struck a match and set fire to a small nest of dry bark. She fed the flame with thin twigs until it made a steady tongue. Then she set the red on it. Satin curled and blackened and went to a dark shine before it broke. Smoke rose with a bitter sweetness. The fabric pulled away from itself in threads that glowed and died. Her face did not change. She watched until there was nothing to watch. Jack turned then because he could, because there was no more looking to be done. He saw her in the long shirt and bare legs and river hair. The red had gone to ash at her feet. His mouth opened and closed once as if a word had come and then left. She came to him. She lifted her hands and put them on his face. Her palms were cool and a little rough from lie and cold, and his beard rasped against them. His eyes flinched shut like a man who had been in the glare too long. He made a sound that did not belong to speech. He held very still. Nora rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a touch given and taken. He answered in a breath and then with his mouth. His hand came to the back of her head, careful and sure fingers threaded in wet hair. The other arm circled her waist as if someone might try to take her from him, and he had decided that would not happen. They set the small tent on the bank where an old cottonwood leaned and broke the wind. Brim stood near with his head down and eye half closed. Inside, the light took color from canvas and made everything warm. He laid his bedroll flat, and she lay on it and pulled him down. There were no words because there were too many. Their hands learned new paths over familiar scars. His touch hovered before it rested, then rested and learned wait. Her breath found his and held to it. The river talked on the other side of the thin wall. Heat moved under skin where cold had lived too long. Later, when the light turned the canvas gray, they lay the way the day had put them. Her head on his shoulder, his arm around her heavy and present. His chest lifted and fell. Her knees were tucked into his legs. The world outside was wet and clean and moving. The world inside was still. She slept. He did not at first. He listened to the river and to the small sounds a person makes when sleep softens fear. He felt the weight of her hair on his arm and the warmth of her breath at his throat. He put his face in her hair and drew in the smell of river and soap, and a thing he did not have a word for. He closed his eyes and something unknotted in the bone behind them. He slept not long, but true. Morning pulled him up like a rope. There was no light yet, only a thinner dark. He knew where he was and who lay against him and what that meant. He sat with a jolt that shook the ground of the tent and made the canvas snap. He pulled his arm from under her and scrubbed his hands over his feet. The cold pressed in at the seams and found sweat and cooled it until it felt like ice. He saw a woman with soot on her cheek in a room that did not exist anymore. He saw a ring of fire on hard dirt. He heard himself too late in a voice that did not sound like his. Nora woke to the sound of him moving away. She pushed up on an elbow and the blanket slid. Her hair had dried in waves. She reached for him with a hand that felt too light and then stopped. He had already set his back toward her. He pulled on his shirt and then the coat without looking at her. He tied the thong of his holster with a neat tug. "Get dressed," he said. His voice was flat in a way that sucked the air out of the tent. Her mouth opened. The words that wanted out were soft ones that would have made her smaller. She closed it. She gathered the shirt to her and slipped from under the blanket and found her boots. She did not hurry, but she did not let any time show either. They broke the tent and shook frost from the canvas. She folded it smoother than it needed to be. He packed in tight, fast movements that put things where they belonged and locked them there. Brim took the bit without fuss. The river moved on as if no one had been there to speak over it. Ash lay gray on the bank where the dress had burned, and the wind took it in a veil that shredded and went. Jack mounted and set his jaw against the cold. Nora swung up and settled in front of him because that is how the saddle and the day were built. His arm came around her waist without warmth and without cruelty. It did what it had to do to keep a person on a moving horse. The trail away from the river climbed into fur and shade. Snow held in pockets. Mud showed its black back where the sun had reached. They rode without words. The only sound was Brim's shoes and soft ground and the high call of a hawk that found the new air and took it. They took the game trail that cut through a slot in the ridge because it was shorter, and because Jack Hale chose it without speaking. The walls rose straight and close. The sky overhead narrowed to a blue seam. Snow clung in shelves and dropped without warning in soft slumps. Brim's ears went forward, then pinned flat. Jack felt the change travel up through the horse. He pulled back on the reins and slid out of the saddle in one motion. His hand hit Nora's knee. "Down," he said. She dropped on the far side of Brim, and the cold bit her palms. Sand ground under her teeth when she breathed. Jack pushed the horse behind a tumble of rock and put Nora into the hollow with him, then leaned into the stone and looked up into the bright seam. A voice came thin and clear from the rim. "Look here, boys." The runaway bride went sightseeing. Brick Talbot stood on a ledge big enough for a stove hat, low arm in a sling from the shoulder Jack had ruined. Two men flanked him. One held a rifle, as if he had to think about where the weight went. The other settled his cheek to the stock, like he had done that more than once. Heat shimmered around their boots, even in this cold. Sun made their coats too bright. Another voice shook itself together and tried to sound hard. "You will hand her over, Hale." Nora knew that voice even before it broke on her name. Reuben Dalrymple held a carbine that looked new to him. His hat cast his eyes in shadow. His mouth had been pulled flat by fear. Jack put his mouth to Nora's ear, and she felt the warmth of it. "When I move, you do not lift your head. You stay exactly where you are." A shot cracked from the right. Stone spat into Jack's cheek, and he tasted blood and grit. He slid 2 feet along the base of the wall and the Winchester came up and spoke twice, smooth and even. The man with the settled cheek jerked and went out of sight. Sound came after, body to rock, and then rock to slide, and then a thump at the bottom of it all. Dust puffed, and then hung in the cold. Brick swore, left, get him under that shelf. Reuben fired. The round struck stone and shrieked out into the bright sky. Jack moved again while the echo drowned the next shot. He saw a boot edge and a pant leg and put around where the rock met that cloth. A yell. The boot jerked back. The rifle skittered and clanged and slid a long way down the face before it caught in a scrub pine. Silence fell fast. The canyon held onto it a second and gave it back. Then the sound Jack heard was a small change in air. He shifted his weight, but not fast enough. A bullet found him from a new angle, low and mean. Heat punched his side above the hip, and then there was cold under the heat, and then there was nothing but the sound of his own breath, trying to find a way through a chest that had decided to tighten. Nora heard him grunt. It was not a cry. It was a sound he could not have stopped if he had tried. She turned and saw his hand go to his side and come away red. He shoved her back down with the same hand and left a smear on the collar of Jack's coat around her shoulders. "I am fine," he said. It was a lie with purpose. He brought the Winchester up again and sent a round to the flash that had given itself away. A curse answered thin with pain. Brick's laugh came down ragged. "You are leaking hail. Makes this easier." A pebble bounced near Nora's cheek and left a bright mark. Her fingers dug into the sand until she found something that held. She found breath and could not find the next one. She made herself find it. Jack pulled the lever and felt the magazine run dry. He slung the rifle, reached back without looking, and found Nora's wrist. The grip was steady. "We are done here," he said. "On my word, we move." Brick started to speak again, something about prices and property. Jack did not hear the rest. He counted to 3 and stood. He put 2 quick shots toward the words to turn them into silence and pulled Nora with him. They ran low, Brim crowding their backs like a dog that knows how to follow and hates it. Jack shoved the rifle into the scabbard and threw himself into the saddle. He dragged Nora up in front of him with his right arm. His left hand found the reins. Blood dampened his belt and found his thigh and stayed there. Bullets chased them. Some struck stone and exploded into light. One found leather and ripped a strap. One sang past Nora's ear so close it blew a strand of hair against her cheek. Sound stacked up inside the slot and crashed back on itself. Brim lunged into the narrow and picked a line that wanted hooves cut quick and clean. Jack's arm was a band across Nora's middle, and she could feel the tremor in it that had nothing to do with cold. The slot opened at a bend that always came sooner when you walked it and later when you needed it. They hit that turn, and the world widened, and the horse found more ground under him. Jack kept Brim aimed at a slump of brush on the far side of a low ridge. Snow piled against it had formed a white wall. A cut showed behind it only if you knew where to look. "Through," he said, and Brim went. Branches clawed. Brush gave and then gave again. They burst into a shallow mouth of rock that faced away from the wind. The ground inside the cave was dry and held the prints of coyotes and deer from another season. It smelled of old smoke and mouse. The ceiling came down enough to make a man bend. Jack slid off the saddle and found ground, and then nearly lost it. His legs went light at the knee. He caught himself with a hand on the wall and left another mark. He turned to lift Nora down and did not have to. She was already on the ground, her hands at his belt, her face white, and set like a person doing sums in her head too fast. "Inside," he said, and the word shook. She put his arm across her shoulders and took his weight and walked him the last steps. He was heavy, and he knew to lift his feet when she told him. She lowered him to the stone and his jaw clenched, and then his head hit his forearm with a sound that made her stomach pull. "Stay with me," she said. She did not know if she said it out loud. She ran for the saddlebag fingers, clumsy buckles stubborn with ice. She pulled everything out into the snow and found the small brown bottle and a roll of linen wrapped in waxed paper. She brought them inside with the Winchester and set all of it on the ground by his hip. She cut his shirt open with his knife and set the cloth back in a clean square. The wound had closed around the bullet and then opened again. Blood came slow and steady. It had a smell that was more metal than meat. She put her palm just above it and felt the heat. She looked at the carbolic and at his face. His eyes were open and not seeing. She shook his shoulder. "I am sorry," she said. She did not know why she said that. She uncorked the bottle and poured. The liquid hit flesh and he arched. A sound came out of him that did not belong to language or to this cave. It bounced off the stone and came back to them both. His hand scrambled for purchase and closed on her wrist. Then it slackened. His eyes rolled white and then closed. His chest went still for a count that emptied her and then rose thin and shallow. "No," she said, "no." She pressed the linen into the wound and leaned her weight on it and breathed with her mouth open because her nose would not draw enough. The cloth reddened. She pulled it away and pressed another and tucked the first under her knee and thought of the kitchen and where she kept clean things, and then thought of nothing but the weight of her hands and the count in her head that kept time with the faint lift of his ribs. Cold gathered at her back and crept toward her hands. She shoved wood into a pile with her foot and found the flint and steel in his kit with a blind grab and struck until spark fell into dry cedar shred. Fire took because she had learned how to ask it to. It moved into a small shape and held. The light made the cave smaller and kinder. She did not look at it long. When the bleeding slowed, she tied the bandage with a strip torn from the bottom of her chemise. It ripped ragged, and she twisted it until it was rope. She knotted it with her teeth and found the hold of it with her fingers. Then she reached to her hair and pulled the red ribbon free. She wrapped it around the linen to fix it and tied it again. The color was wrong and right against the pale of him. It held. She touched his cheek. His skin was hot and then cold inside the heat. She took his hand and set it flat against the warm rock and covered it with both of hers. She listened hard for another breath and found one and then the next. Outside, wind worried the brush that hid the cave. Inside, fire ticked, and the smell of carbolic sharpened the air until her eyes watered. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and tasted salt and iron. Brim stamped and huffed, then settled. Nora leaned into the pressure of her own hands and spoke with her mouth almost on his ear. "Do not die," she said. "Do not leave me." She kept saying it until the words lost sound and became the rhythm she used to hold the cloth in place and to count the breaths that came thin and then steadier each one, a small, stubborn miracle in the cold dark. Night and day traded places without light. Fever made its own weather. Jack Hale drifted on a heat that burned without flame. Names rose in it like fish and sank again. A woman with soot on her cheek spoke from a room that had no door. He tried to answer and could not find his mouth. Nora kept her hands where they had to be. One palm on the bandage, one on his wrist when the shaking came. The red ribbon held the linen tight and looked wrong, then right, then only like a thing that did its job. The cave breathed in cold and gave it back. Fire put a warm circle on the stone and held fast. She wet a strip of cloth in the seep that crawled from the back wall and wiped his face, his neck, the hollow of his throat. She spoke in a voice that did not ask anything. When he clawed at the ground and tried to turn, she set her weight to him and kept him there. The second night, the fever climbed until his skin was dry and hot. When it broke fast. His breath came softer. The hard lines at the corners of his mouth eased. He slept without moving until the small fire fell to coals, and she had to choose between warmth and water. She fed one, then the other, and went back to his side every time. When he opened his eyes, they had the flat gray he carried in other rooms, and something else she did not know how to name. He looked at the ceiling of rock, and then turned his head an inch and found her. Her hair was tied back with a twist of cloth. Her face was pale with tired and streaked with ash. She held the cup to his mouth, and he drank in little swallows that looked like work. The water had the taste of stone, clean and stubborn. "You are still here," he said. "I am still here," she said. He watched the flame tremble on the end of a stick and go steady again. He worked one hand free of the blanket and tried to rub his face. He found the bandage at his side and touched the knot without pressure. His fingers brushed the ribbon and stayed there. "I should have kept my hands off you," he said. The words had edges. "At the river. After. I woke and felt like I had broken something I had no right to touch." She sat on her heels and waited. The fire made a soft ticking sound, pine sap bursting in tiny stars. "I saw Anna," he said. He looked past her at a wall. "I smelled smoke. I heard the sound a person makes when they do not want to die yet. I heard it again, and I could not put it down. I thought, if I want you, I am stealing from a grave. I do not have language for that shame." She did not touch him. Her hands stayed open on her knees. "It was not only shame," he said, and a kind of surprise came into the voice that belonged to the man, not the fever. "I needed. I have been cold for so long I did not know a body could come back from it, and then it did. I was afraid of that, more than of getting shot in a slot with a child who cannot hold on to a horse yet. That fear is not noble. It is a small animal with teeth. It makes you push away the thing that woke you up, because if you keep it, you could lose it." Nora drew a breath and let it out. The ribbon held. His skin had gone cooler under her palm. Outside, the brush hissed in a wind that could not find the mouth of the cave. "I am not a ghost," she said. Her voice was steady. "I am not Anna. I do not know what your life was with her. I am Nora Quinn. I am here. I have blood on my hands from pressing this cloth, and there is grease on my sleeve, and my feet hurt inside my boots. I am not an idea you are afraid to touch. I do not blow away." He turned his head then and looked at her fully. The shame was still there, but it had company. He lifted the hand that had been on the ribbon and set it to her cheek like a man testing if a thing is warm or not. His thumb was rough and his touch careful. Her skin leaned into it before she told it to. "I pushed you away because I did not want to see what I had already done," he said. "Not because you are dirty. I do not think that. I think Malloy is dirt, and the men that watch him. I think I am a man who made a poor decision on the bank of a river, and then another one in a tent, because old bones remembered a fire." She turned her face and kissed the heel of his hand, a small thing soft like a wet leaf on a stone. He let his breath go and it shook a little. "Drink," she said, and brought the cup again. He took more this time. She fed him a strip of rabbit, held it while he chewed. He did not thank her with words, so he watched her face, which was the same thing with him. He slept again, but not hard. When he woke, the light in the cave had shifted the way it does when a day shows itself without sun. He tried to sit up with the way a man does who has always managed it before. His breath hit the wall of his ribs and lodged. He lay back with a hiss. She slid an arm behind his shoulders and raised him slow. His teeth sank into his lower lip and left a crescent. They worked together small motions. He sat with his back to the wall at last and stared at nothing until the color came back to his mouth. She put the rifle in his lap and oiled rag in his palm. He looked at it as if she had handed him a thing from another country. He set the rag to the barrel and wiped, and the muscle memory remembered what the mind had not wanted to. The metal took the oil and gave back a mean shine. "Why did you come for me?" she asked. Her eyes stayed on his hands working the rag. "You were dragged into a room where men kept their mouths quiet," he said. "I have been that quiet. It makes you sick. I wanted it out of my body." She nodded. "You do not owe me a reason," she said, "but I will take that one." By afternoon, he stood with an arm braced on the wall and his head bowed. He took 3 steps and stopped, and took 3 more. Sweat ran cold down his spine and made a road under the bandage. She went outside and checked the snares and came back with a bird proud in a way that made her look younger for a blink, and then older again. He smiled at that bird as if it had told a joke. The movement pulled his side and his eyes watered. He laughed once anyway. It sounded out of place in the cave and perfect. The second evening he drew her down without speaking. His mouth tasted of metal and wood smoke and something clean. They moved slow the way you do when every step has to count. It was not hunger. It was rest. His hand mapped the bones of her shoulder, the line where her hair lay on her neck, the small scar she had from a kettle burn years ago. She set her palm flat on his chest and counted the beats in his ribs and did not hurry them. When they lay still again, the fire had settled into a patient glow. The ribbon at his side looked like a small flag planted in a place one without flags. Morning made a line of white on the brush that hid their entrance. Jack stood with his hand on the rock to hold himself up and looked outward as if the air beyond the cave had words printed in it. "They will come," he said. There was no drama in it. It came like weather. Men like Malloy do not forget that something was taken from them. Nora tightened the knot on a bundle of sticks and set it by the fire. She straightened and wiped her palms on her thighs, her mouth set calm and sure. "I am done running," she said. "I have run since I had legs. From Reuben, from that room, from the bottom of a door that would not lift." She met his eyes and held them. "We stop running." He looked at her for a long moment, as if the inside of him were catching up to the outside. His face changed in a way that did not make it softer, only more true. He put his hand out and she stepped into it. "All right," he said. They did not talk about how. There were no lists. They fed the fire and ate and cleaned the pan and packed what could be turned into something else. He showed her again how to lay the rifle along a rock and breathe with it. She slid the stock into her shoulder and sighted until the world narrowed to a single circle and the pool at the end of it. She lowered the barrel and smiled without showing teeth. He eased himself down and watched her hands. The cave held their quiet. The brush kept back the wind. The ribbon held. The coals breathed. They made ready by learning each other's movements until those movements were the same thing. Night took Red Hollow in a clean grip. Snow lay thin on the roofs and made each plank on the boardwalk bright as bone. The air held the smell of cold iron and smoke from a dozen stoves. In the alley behind the Iron Horse, the dark held close and breathed a little. Jack Hale pressed his shoulder to the brick and listened. The saloon gave off a low thrum, laughter and piano and glass, the sound of a town pretending not to be afraid. Nora Quinn stood 2 steps behind him with the rifle laid along her thigh. Her face sat quiet in the shadow. The red ribbon was tied at Jack's bandage under his shirt. It held and did not show. A shape came out of the dark and startled with a soft breath. Lila rose. She had her shawl over her head and a tin bucket in her hands. She looked like a woman taking out dishwater and looked like someone who wanted to throw it on fire. "Keys," Jack said. She lifted a hand that shook and pressed metal into his palm. "He is inside," she whispered. "He came back when the wind turned. 2 boys and the bartender. Sheriff is at the far corner table. You know his hour." Jack nodded. Lila swallowed and set the empty bucket down and wrapped her arms around her middle. "Ezra Whitlow," Jack said. "Root cellar," she said, and tipped her head toward the general store. "He is a nervous man until he is not." They moved quick and low. The back door of Whitlow's store opened on a light that moved. Ezra Whitlow stood in the cellar with a lantern and a face that had made up its mind. Behind him, old canvas sagged on hooks. The floor held slopped rings of oil and the sharp reek of turpentine. "Not here," he said, voice steady now. "Back room." I stacked the tins like a wall. Jack took the lantern and shook his head. No light. Whitlow blew it out. They stood in the dark and could still see, because mines do that when they have to. "Ring the bell when you see flame," Jack said. "I will not miss," Whitlow said. He sounded like a man who had wanted to say that a long time. "Get your girl out." They left him in the dark with his decision. Wind came up the alley soft and turned the corner. Jack put his hand to the back door of the saloon and felt the cold in the wood where it met the jamb. He fit Lila's key. The lock turned without sound. He pulled the door in a hand's breadth and air came that smelled of beer lamp oil, fried meat men. The kitchen was a square of dim and a table with a boy on it, his head in his arms. A pot hung cold. Grease lined the sides in a thick shine. Jack stepped past and set the door to without letting it click. They crossed the short hall. The back room opened to the main floor with a doorway near the stair. The room beyond lay wider than a church and lower. Men sat with their backs to one another and their faces to their drinks. The big mirror behind the bar was a black hole now starred with the 1,000 cuts Jack had given it. It held the lamps as little moons. Victor Malloy stood by the front door with his coat on. He had that look men get when a plan builds in the air above their heads. Sheriff Amos Kincaid sat at the corner table with a half-inch of whiskey in his glass. The clock behind the bar put its hands to 9. The second hand ticked like a nail tapping wood. Nora eased beside the doorway with the rifle set to her shoulder. Jack slid out into the edge of lamplight low. He put his palm to the Colt at his hip, and it felt like a thing that knew what his hand was for. Lila ghosted to the foot of the stairs, with her shawl pulled tight and her eyes on the floor. The first bell hit with the force of a hammer. It came from the far end of the street and rolled down the block. A long iron clang, then another, then the rush of feet. Malloy turned his head toward the sound like a dog hearing a wagon. Kincaid stood with his glass left where it was. Chairs scraped. The street outside took on a new color as orange climbed the window glass. "Store," someone shouted from the porch. "Fire at Whitlow's." Malloy stepped to the doorway, and the sheriff stepped past him and into the night with 3 men at his back. The room bled bodies toward the street, until only the bartender and 2 of Malloy's boys and 1 old man stayed. The old man stared at his hands. His hands did not shake. Malloy looked once more at the window flame, and then back into the room, and that told Jack what he needed to know. He had stayed. His 2 boys had stayed. The door sucked cold air and shut itself with a wooden sigh. Jack walked out into the open with the Colt level. The first boy at the bar was slow to understand and slower to lift his gun. Jack put a round center of him. He folded with his elbows out and slid down the front of the bar like a man going to kneel and forgetting how. The second boy lifted a shotgun by the twin barrels, and Jack shot him at the throat before the hinge could close. He fell face first, and the butt of the shotgun clapped the floor as his hand let go. The bartender dropped behind the rail and stayed there. The room made a space and held it. Smoke from the far fire pushed under the door and brought with it the sting of pitch. The bell kept its work steady and tireless. Malloy drew. He did it quick, but he did it full of heat. Heat is a poor friend to hands. His shot took a lamp chimney and sent glass raining. Flame ran up the wick and bent into smoke. Jack did not fire. He kept the barrel on Malloy's chest and felt the pull in his finger ask to be made into something, and waited. He moved 3 steps to his right to keep the lined sight true. Nora stepped out of the shadow then, and the room felt the change without knowing why. She brought up Jack's second revolver with both hands and set her foot the way he had taught her. The barrel looked steady in the light, and the hands looked steady, and the eyes behind them did not ask anything. She wore Jack's clean shirt tucked into work trousers and boots that did not fit, and looked like a person who had learned the way out of a room that has no door. Malloy laughed a little. It had the sound men have when they have more fear than place to put it. He did not look at Nora long. He slid his gaze past her to something he could grab. He found Lila, who had not moved, and took her in a single step. His arm came around her throat, and his gun found her temple. "Drop it," he said. His breath touched Lila's hair, and she went white under it. "Both of you." Jack kept the Colt on Malloy and said nothing. He felt the room tilt toward the front door where help had gone. He felt his side pull at the bandage and ignored it. He set his boots where they needed to be and watched for a space that would appear if it appeared. "Do not be stupid," Malloy said. "I have had a long bad week." Nora did not lower the gun. She did not raise it. She moved to the side, 1, 2, 3 steps along the line of the bar until the angle changed. Lila's face came into view past Malloy's shoulder. Her eyes met Nora's. There was something there that knew what practice is for. Jack's breath held in his throat. He felt it. He did not speak. Nora aimed for the point where arm turns to elbow. She remembered the way Jack had placed her feet in the cave. She remembered to breathe. She remembered how a trigger wants to be pulled slow at the last, and not jerked. She squeezed. The shot tore the room. Malloy's arm buckled. Bone does not like hot lead. His hand opened without asking him. The pistol fell and clattered and skittered under a table. Lila twisted out of his grip and dropped to the floor and rolled behind the stair post. Malloy stared at his arm as if it had turned traitor. Blood lined his sleeve and dripped from his fingertips in a slow, dark run. He reached with his left for the gun on the floor. Jack fired once. The bullet hit Malloy where a man's rage will not stop it. Malloy's legs unspooled and set him in the sawdust, like he had decided to sit, and then changed his mind too late. His mouth opened and then closed. His eyes went to the ceiling and then did not go anywhere. Silence came hard. It made men look up. The doors blew wide and brought with them cold air and bell echo and a crosswind of smoke. Sheriff Kincaid stood there with a crowd behind him and a smudge of soot across his cheek. His gun was out, and then it was not. He took in the 2 men by the bar who would not rise. He took in Malloy's body and Lila's breath with her hands on the stair post, and Nora with the revolver at her hips and Jack with the Colt still up and steady. He looked at the bartender crouched behind the rail, whose eyes had grown while he hid. Kincaid set his hand flat on the door jamb. His eyes went to Whitlow standing at the back of the crowd with his hair pushed up by heat and his coat open. The glow from the burning store threw light across all their faces and made them look carved. "I have been hearing things," Kincaid said. His voice filled the room in a way that was not loud. "A girl brought in under paper that was not worth a tree, a man held against law. He wrote for himself a town too quiet. I am looking at the end of it." No one spoke. The piano sat with its keys shining like teeth. The mirror threw back broken moons. Kincaid pointed with 2 fingers at Nora. "Miss Quinn," he said, "you are free of any claim. You were never not. You want it written, I will write it." He shifted his hand to Malloy without touching him. "This here is justifiable by any court that remembers what the word is for." He turned his head to the bartender. "You will close this place until the dust settles and the floor is scrubbed of him." The bartender nodded so fast his hat fell off, and he did not notice. Kincaid looked at Jack. The 2 men stared at each other a beat too long to be only about law. Then the sheriff lifted his chin toward the door. "Get out of here," he said, not unkind. "Both of you." Jack lowered the Colt and took the revolver from Nora's hands. Her fingers opened and closed, and then opened again as if they were not sure what they were for. He set one gun in his belt, spun the other once to make sure it ran smooth, and set it home. He put his hand to Nora's shoulder. She did not flinch. He let his hand slide down and found her fingers. They were cold and strong. They walked to the door through a lane the town made without being told. Men stepped back and looked at their boots and then looked up. Lila stood and put her hand to Nora's sleeve and squeezed and let go. Whitlow watched them pass with his mouth set and his eyes wet. Kincaid moved aside and the doors opened wider. The night hit their faces with clean cold and ash. Firelight from Whitlow's store threw a veil of sparks into the sky. The bell rang once more and stopped. Jack and Nora came down the steps and into the street. The snow had softened and taken prints. Brim stood in the alley where Jack had left him, with his head up and his ears pricked. Jack did not look back. Nora did not either. They crossed the line where lamplight fades to dark, and the air turned thin and clear. The town behind them kept breathing and saying its old names. The street ahead did not say anything. The cold took their breath and showed it and let it go. They walked the horse until the town lost its corners. Snow made the world quiet. Frost rhymed the grass where it showed. When the sky took on that first thin silver before dawn, they turned into the trees and followed an old elk path that gave them cover. Jack Hale kept one hand on Brim's withers and the other low at Nora's back. She balanced in the saddle with her knees and watched the dark thin into morning. By full light, the ridge showed itself the same cut of blue and rock he had stared at for months. The small cabin on the shoulder of the hill still held to the slope like a sapling that had learned to bend. Jack led Brim to the lean-to and stood with his palm on the horse's neck until the gelding's breath turned slow. He pushed the door and the room met them, with old smoke and the cold of rooms that forget people. Nora set Jack's coat on the chair, as if it were a living thing. She walked to the shelf where the tin cup sat beside the little shard of mirror. The glass caught the light and made a coin of it. Her face fit inside that coin and did not bother to be pretty or ruined. She reached up and folded the mirror into a scrap of cloth and set it in a pocket as if you could carry luck if you were gentle. Jack stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the stove. He opened the door and checked the firebox out of habit. His mouth moved but gave no words. Then he began. Rope came down, nails came up, boards lifted where they could. He worked in the sure quiet of a man who understands how wood listens to a tool. Nora held the door as he dragged the stove across the threshold. Metal groaned, breath smoked, their fingers blackened with old soot. They took the things that had weight and use and left the rest. The table that rocked stayed. The rope bed came. The potbelly stove went on a small sledge Jack rigged from a door and saplings. He set the load on poles, and Brim took it in a patient lean. Nora walked ahead and tapped the ice on the creek with a stick to test it. The sun climbed and slid. They moved. The ridge opened to a long meadow cupped in aspens and pine, a run of clear water down its center like a seam of glass. Jack stopped with his hand on Brim's cheek and looked at the place. The trees made a windbreak. The ground lifted just enough to shed water. In late season, the light would come longer. He exhaled and nodded, not to her, not to the horse, but to the idea that a person could stand still without freezing. They cut a first notch into a standing dead spruce. The trunk sighed and came down with the neat certainty of gravity. The smell of resin filled the air, sharp and sweet. Jack taught her to set the draw knife and pull with her arms, not her shoulders. The blade whispered as it peeled the long curls. Husked wood shone pale and clean. She laughed once at the feel of the tool catching the right bite, then bit her lip and kept working. Her palms blistered and then hardened. They rolled logs. They stacked them to a shoulder height and cut the joints tight so no wind could slide through. Mud and straw and creek sand made a rough mortar that cinched the gaps. Nora carried pails until her arms hummed. Jack lifted and set and lifted again. Fire at night ate everything they fed it and asked for more. Morning frost grew feathers on the cedar shingles they split. When the sun touched them, the feathers melted and ran into the seams. On the third week, Jack walked Brim into a little town 4 days away and laid the last of his coins on a counter that smelled of grease and coffee. A man wrapped 2 panes of glass in straw and canvas and tied the bundle with twine. He handed back a small folded packet of nails as if he wanted to be part of the building without going where the air was clean. Jack thanked him, a quiet nod, and turned the horse's head home. Nora cooked at a fire ring while he was gone and talked to the chickens she had traded for with mending and 2 jars of preserves to a peddler with a sharp hat and a softer voice. The birds blinked like old ladies and made small noises at her stitching. When Jack came out of the trees again, smelling of dust and sun and something like cinnamon from the store, she set the pot to one side and stood to take the glass from him with both hands. They framed the windows together, wood squares that fit the panes without pinching. He set each piece on thin bed clay and eased the glass into place with his thumbs. The light turned gentle as it came through new to passing a thing filed that thin. Nora held her breath as he hammered the last brad. The window held and made a picture of the meadow that would not move even when wind combed the new grass. They set the stove and sealed the pipe. Jack knelt to lay kindling and shaved dry curls into the belly the way you feed a newborn. Nora lit with the match cupped in her hand. Flame climbed and took, and then the stovetop pinged once and again as metal learned heat. The smell of iron and old dust gave way to the smell of burning pine and a slice of rabbit browning and bacon grease. She tore a bit of crust from a pan of cornbread that was too heavy and too proud and held it up for him to taste. He chewed and nodded, and she laughed, because you do not have to be fine to be good. He worked late by firelight on a thing he did not name. A block of fine pine sat across his knees. The knife made a rhythm. He cut lines that were not burred this time. He cut 2 legs in a stretcher and a slanted top. He rubbed oil into the wood with his own hands until it glowed like honey in a jar. He carved a shallow vine along the side because the work asked for a small grace. He fitted a drawer to the space so clean you could not see the seam. When she bent to look, he slid the drawer out and set a ribbon inside it, red, gone brown at the edges, tied in a quiet knot. "For your books," he said, a little rough. She set her fingers to the carvings and smiled at the feel. She pulled the drawer open an inch and touched the ribbon once, quick, then closed it. A family found them because word finds its own roads. 2 children rode in on a mule with a neck like an old broom. The boy wore a hat that was too big. The girl sat straight as a fence post. Their name was Miller. Nora set them on stools at the little desk and chalked an A that looked like an open TP. She told them the sound it makes when you start a word like apple or arrow or ask. Jack sat by the door and mended a harness and did not look like he was listening, and listened. On a warm night, the first thunderheads of summer piled beyond the far ridge. He stood on the porch with a strip of leather and an awl and watched the light play under the clouds like small fires turning in a pocket. Nora stepped out in a dress she had sewn from white cotton she had traded for with mending, and a pan of biscuits that finally came out right. The dress was plain. The color made the rest of her louder, hair braided and loose at the end, bare feet in the grass. She stepped down into the meadow and lifted her arms. She turned slow palms open, the white bending at her knees. Her feet pressed the grass and it gave, and then stood back up again. The window caught her and framed her and sent her back whole. Jack set the leather aside and covered his mouth with his hand and felt something in his chest give like ice at breakup. He did not call to her. He watched until the sting behind his eyes went hot, and he let it. He put his face in both hands and the tears came quiet and hard. She came to him and knelt and set her thumbs at his temples and wiped them away as if they were sawdust. She did not ask. He breathed out against her wrist and nodded, and she rose and pulled him up, and he held her, and the new porch boards creaked once and then forgot about it. Winter found them again, but it met a house that held its own heat. The woodpile was high. Smoke drew clean through the pipe. Snow shouldered the roof and sat there like a sleeping dog. They read by lamplight when the evenings ran long. He sounded out words, the lines slow and halting, and then sure. She mended shirts and tucked things into the saddlebag he kept under the bed, and one night her fingers found a slit in the lining. She pinched out a square of paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times to make soft creases. The handwriting was stubborn letters built like fences. She read under her breath and then aloud because the room was ready for it. "She wants to be a teacher," it said. "After Malloy and the room and the dress. She still has light. I have not seen it in years. It shows me my dark, and I'm afraid, and I want it anyway. I think life can be beautiful." She held the paper a beat longer than a breath. When she looked up, he was already looking at her. He tried to speak and did not. She crossed the room in 3 steps and pressed her forehead to his and let the paper fall and flutter and land on the rug like a small white moth. Snow came hard that week. Wind found the cracks they had missed and told on them, and they found the cracks and fixed them. The fire burned steady. In the morning, Jack opened the door, and the world was white and quiet, and the pines bowed under the weight. He shut it, and the latch fell and held. Heat lay thick in the little room. The windows wore rime like lace, and where the panes cleared, you could see the meadow and the track of one rabbit and the line of a fox following. He set 2 tin cups on the table and poured coffee. She came to him with cold hair from the water bucket, and he put his palms to her cheeks and warmed them. "Home," he said. She stood with him and watched the glass clear a little more and nodded. Home. The stove ticked as it settled. The ribbon lay quiet in its drawer. The windows held the light like hands. Outside, the wind ran its tracks in the snow and then covered them. Inside, the room kept warmth, and the 2 of them kept each other. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.